As many of you know by now, for us at the Swedish Radio, quality journalism is of the greatest importance, both when it comes from us as a public service company, but also when it comes from the rest of the media industry, where daily newspapers are definitely key players. It is important that in the days we are now facing with a fast-growing network society, that media owners have the courage and the will to invest in investigative journalism. Because it is expensive, and yes, it might fail, but it is very vital for a well-functioning democratic society. And with the backing of these owners, of course, it is as vital that there are reporters out there and editors with even more courage, because when we don't fail, when we actually expose things that others have been working very hard not to get exposed, it very often leads to threat, both in the open and undercover. To be a successful investigative reporter, it is a difficult task in many aspects, and many times when they do decide to publish, they know beforehand that there will be tough times to follow, but they decide to do so anyway, because not to do so is not an option. With this said, it is important for us at the Swedish Radio that every year here at Almedalen, this great place, bring you one important story. Not necessarily to lobby for us, for public service, but to expose the importance of good quality journalism. This time, this year, this story has an intriguing combination, if you ask me, of investigative journalism, scared politicians, and by now a world-known whistleblower. So I'm very, very, very honored to hand over this microphone to our moderator of today, Mrs. Ginna Lindberg, our former US correspondent in Washington, now head of our current affairs. She will be moderating the whole session, and of course also a very, very, very welcome to our guest of honor, Mr. Paul Johnson, who is the Deputy Editor of The Guardian. And to you all.
Welcome, everyone, to this seminar about one of the biggest journalistic stories in recent years, the revelation of the Snowden files. My name is Ginna Lindberg, and I will be moderating this seminar, and I'm delighted to introduce to you Paul Johnson, who is the Deputy Editor at The Guardian, the paper that wrote the story about Edward Snowden. We have a panel here today also of distinguished journalists. Fredrik Laurin is here, well-known investigative journalist, soon to be head of the investigative team at the Swedish Radio. Wolodarski is here, publisher and editor-in-chief at Dagens Nyheter, and Anders Lindberg, political editor at Aftonbladet. And full disclosure, he and I are not related, we just share the same beautiful last name. We will hear from you in the panel a little later on. So it's without doubt the biggest journalistic story of the last year, and one of the biggest surveillance revelations of our time, actually, the Snowden affair. How would you, first of all, characterize this story? How big of a scoop is it?
Well, I think it's enormous. We didn't realise how big it was at first, but as it's sort of echoed out across nations, it's been quite extraordinary. I mean, we've seen what's happened in the United States, where President Obama and John Kerry have got involved and saying it's a conversation we need to have. We see legislation enacted, or about to be enacted in the United States with overviews. We've seen the visceral reaction of those countries who feel they're on the receiving end of this. In Mexico, in Brazil, we now know about Angela Merkel's phone having been hacked for 10 years. We know about the surveillance that's carried out on the Spanish, on the French. We know about the surveillance that's carried out on our allies. We didn't necessarily know that people say, well, spy. But when we hosted summits in London, we didn't know we were setting up false internet cafes in order to spy on the South Africans and the Turks. We didn't know necessarily that Britain and the United States were spying on the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, and the EU itself. It's extraordinary. I mean, and the stories keep coming, the stories keep echoing. The latest story is in the Washington Post this morning, which shows a list of 193 countries, whereby, well, they're on that list, so they become targets of the NSA. So it's a story that has got sort of bigger and bigger over time. The ramifications become clearer and clearer.
That's every country in the world, except for?
Except for?
UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are the only ones that the NSA did not have authorization to spy on, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Quite extraordinary.
Are you surprised about the story in Washington Post today?
Well, we've had lots and lots of surprises on what is now a long journey, just over a year. And actually, we're not that surprised, actually, to be quite honest. I mean, once you found out that, you know, the Chancellor's handset was bugged for 10 years, once you found out that sort of politicians, tradespeople, or the rest of it were targeted in such a way, you cease to become... You're not surprised about the extent to which the intelligence services will sort of operate.
We are going to talk more about the aftermath and the revelations in themselves. But first, this remarkable story and how it came to happen. You will help walk us through this story. So, a year ago, in May last year, Edward Snowden, this young American intelligence expert, contacted you. What happened?
He contacted Greenwald at least 3 times. And Glenn didn't get around to sort of contacting him back. At one point he even he was asking Glenn to encrypt his system so he could send him secure messages. And Glenn didn't do this. And at one point, Snowden, we didn't know it was Snowden then, sent Glenn a video, essentially, of instructing him how to encrypt. Which was extraordinary, and it was a video that was sort of taken over Snowden's shoulder. There were no hands or anything like that. He was obviously a security expert. But essentially, looking back on it, he was saying, come on, please, I've got stuff to tell you. But Laura Quatros, who he'd also known about as well, gave Glenn a prod. And Glenn, of course, worked for us, so it ended up with one of the reporters that we have, Ewan McCaskill, and Glenn and Laura going to Hong Kong, where this connection was. Didn't know who it was. Glenn has subsequently said he thought it would be about a 60-year-old sort of West Coast American spy in a Brooks Brothers shirt and a tweed jacket, who was probably after a lot of money. And they were asked to go to this particular hotel and stand in a foyer next to a mock-up of an alligator and look for a man with a Rubik Cube. And they went Rubik Cube, yeah. And anyway, they went to the foyer. They found the alligator, easy enough. They couldn't find the man with the Rubik Cube. So they hung around for a couple of hours, making themselves look pretty obvious, and then went away. And then they were called back. And this time, next to the alligator was a man with a Rubik Cube. And of course, their first impression was, well, this can't be right. He's so young. He looked about 20, 22. And it turned out he was 28. But he looked very, very young. And then the conversations had been followed. He took them to his room, where he'd barely been out of the room. So there was about 10 days' worth of Chinese food stacked up on plates and so on and so forth. And one of his security measures was to put pillows all around the door to prevent any sort of eavesdropping, etc. And then the story developed from there. And one of our reporter who went there, Ewan McCaskill, is a very, very experienced reporter, and his main job was verification. And he had to go through quite a lot of checks with Snowden, as we came to be, and he also had to follow his instincts. So we were sat in New York, and we were sat in London, and we were waiting for the password, which would say, this is a very big story, this is the start of something big. And we sat there, and we use Tor, in actual fact, encrypted machines that will wipe as well. And we were sat there waiting for the message, and the message came through, and the message was, the Guinness is good. This is a slight allusion to Ewan's predilection. He's very keen on Guinness. And so we decided that was going to be the phrase. So the Guinness is good. As soon as we saw that note, the Guinness is good, we thought, gosh, this is going to be a very big story.
Did you understand at the time how big a story it would be, the impact of it?
No, although quite quickly we realised, because the first story we did was about Verizon, the American telephone company. And that was the first story that we sort of got going. I mean, the documents are quite complicated. We'll come on to this in a minute. It's not a simple matter of going in and plucking a story out. But the Verizon story was there, and it showed just how in cahoots the telephone company was with the NSA and the government in that sense, and enabling surveillance to be carried out via telephonic communications. And we were about to publish this, and I was sat in my office quite late one night, and Alan was flying from London to New York, so he was in the air.
Alan Rusbridger,
who's the editor-in-chief, yes. And the news desk came and they said, we've got the FBI on the phone for you. And I thought, oh, this is quite unusual. So, and the man came on, he was very, very polite, he was very nice. His name was Sean Joyce, and he was Deputy Director General of the FBI. And he said, we think you're making a mistake here. I've been talking to, and you've been talking to Janine Gibson, our American editor, and he said, I don't think she gets it. She doesn't understand the importance here, so I'm asking you not to publish at the moment. It's a delayed publication for 7 days or so, until we talk to you about the importance of this story. As I say, he was very polite, and it was slightly threatening. It was one of those telephone calls you don't, I was sat down on my desk, but you stand up immediately when you talk to the Deputy Director. You know, there's no slouching or anything, even though he was 3,500 miles away. I realised that things were getting really serious when halfway through this conversation I heard one of our reporters running down the room, and it's one of our investment reporters. And he had his phone out like this, and he said, it's MI5. They want to talk to you urgently. At that point we realised this was getting quite serious. Anyway, we said to Sean Joyce that we were going to go ahead and publish. We understood his reasons for arguing why we should wait, but we had been in negotiations via the American office for quite a few days. We understood the concerns, we'd negotiated some of those concerns, but we felt that we had to move on. We particularly felt we had to move on because we were always very scared about injunctions in the UK. I don't know if people know, but we have a thing called prior restraint in the UK, whereby you can be prevented from publishing before publication, and the case will then go to court, and then you have to argue it through. That's fine, but in British law, the arguing through bit can take years, certainly months. And we were very frightened of getting caught in a sort of quagmire.
And you decided to be very careful, obviously, and to take extra precautions with this material. You set up a secure room at the Guardian.
We did. We had to transfer the material from New York, and that was an extremely complicated process. And we decided to do it we did it at night time because we wanted the office basically clear, and we had to use some quite unusual technology. And it took a long time as it was formatted, re-formatted, re-encrypted, and encrypted again, etc. And it was quite a surreal scene where we sat in a very unusual area of our office building. And we were watching this stuff come through, and the machines that we were using, we were watching them load. We couldn't see the material, we were watching them load. And suddenly one of the cleaners comes up with his vacuum cleaner, and he's on the phone as well to his friends in Spanish, and he started to look at this group of people. It was in darkness, essentially. We were just watching stuff on the screens. Anyway, off he went with his vacuum cleaner. We were a bit worried about that. But we eventually got the stuff there, and what we did was we set up a secure room. It was a room quite close to the top of the building, away from any journalists, in actual fact. The closest area was a commercial area. And it was approached down one corridor, and we had a guard outside all the time. We had an American reporter come at one point and he said, is that guard armed? We said, well, we don't carry guns in England. No, he's not. But he's quite a formidable character in a close sort of fight situation. We made sure that no phones were in the room. We taped all the windows up, and all the machinery we put in there was completely clean. It was brand new, had never been used, and wasn't linked to any system. So we did all that. And we took lots of other precautions as well. We didn't use our phones. We only talked to each other via talk when we were doing this, and consequently it got to be the most difficult and the most demanding story. Because if you can't talk to people face to face, if you're trying to edit across 3 different time zones, yes, 4 different time zones and 3 different continents, it's very, very complicated, and it's very expensive as well. But we set up this room, and we also set out a lot of rules about this because we didn't want to be reckless. So we established a set of rules, and rule number 1 was that there was to be no fishing in this. Rule number 2, that we would not expose any names at all. This was
fishing. Could you explain the fishing part?
We didn't go in there and use search terms like Ahmadinejad or anything like that. That wasn't the purpose, or Iraq, or use individuals and so on and so forth. We didn't use that. In fact, we stayed well clear of all that Middle Eastern elements. The back of our mind was the reason that we'd received this, and that was only one of 4 parcels out there, and we didn't know what the others had, and we didn't really know what we had. We could just see the amount of it, the amount of data there was that we knew Edward Snowden right from the start. His imperative for leaking this, and this is somebody who could be looking at a very, very long prison sentence. He was in quite some personal jeopardy himself. We've seen what's happened to Chelsea Manning. His imperative here was to establish the amount of surveillance and the actual scooping up, the trawling of bulk data. So that's what we concentrated on. We concentrated on the bulk data surveillance, and we concentrated on the spying on allies and the spying itself on other nations. We also made sure that the password protections were all there, so no one person had a password that could open up any of the computers. And we had shredders and so on and so forth. A key conversation, because he sat down and he started the conversation with the words, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, the Attorney General, and others in government have got a problem with you. I've never seen such a big metaphorical stick wielded in the air. So, I mean, he was perfectly straightforward about this, but one of his things was, he said, well, you've started your debate, you've had your fun, and now we want the stuff back. And we said, well, it's not up to politicians or civil servants come to that to prescribe the debate about these issues. The debate about these issues is quite fundamental to civil liberties, etc., and the amount of surveillance. And we had real reasons to believe. We'd done a story about a week or so earlier about an operation called Tempora, which is a massive operation. British intelligence agencies are very, very proud of this. It's the ability to tap underwater cables. About 25% of the world's internet traffic comes across Britain and into Europe from America and the other way around. And Tempora gives it the ability, it's a bit like iPlayer or SkyPlayer, it just slows it down. It gives it the ability to tap into at least 46 of these cables at any one time, but 200 cables in total, to get 600 million telephonic events per day. Somebody's worked out that it's the equivalent to the information that can be lifted per day is the equivalent of all the information in the British Library times 192. It's just staggering, and it was about mastering the internet. But why we were really concerned about this story was that we subsequently found out that the Cabinet didn't know about this. There's a thing called the National Security Council, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. They didn't know about this. And there's a thing called the ISC, the main committee in Parliament that oversees intelligence matters. They didn't know about it either. So if they didn't know about an operation like that, there were real difficult questions to be asked. But when we started negotiating with the government on this, their first point was that we shouldn't publish anything at all. And then they retreated into a position which said, we don't want you to use the names of the telephone companies that are operating, the companies that operate in the cables. So we said, okay, we'll take the names out. And retrospectively, Süddeutsche Zeitung published the names about 3 weeks later, I think. And retrospectively, we realised that was a matter of embarrassment, not necessarily national security. So there was a reaction to these stories. So that the next thing was when we did the story about the London summits, where we hosted, under the last government, summits for our allies to talk about trade matters. And it turns out the intelligence agencies set up fake internet cafes in order to tap sort of diplomats, etc. But they particularly targeted the Turks and the South Africans. So we published this. So then the story got really embarrassing for the government, and I think that was the precursor for them coming in. So it was a fairly straightforward conversation. You've had your fun, you've started the debate, that's the end of it. There was a difference of opinion about that, and we said no, we wouldn't. Anyway, it ended in a slightly odd way because Jeremy Hayward and the other chap got up, and Alan's office overlooks a canal, and there's some flats over the other side of the canal. And one of them from the government side said, "Oh, I wonder which flat our boys are in." But it was done with such a straight face, you thought, perhaps that was true, we didn't know.
Were there specific threats made?
Yes, they came back a little while later, about 12, 14 days later, with another conversation saying, well, that is it now, we do want the material back. There are those in government who want to go to law, there are those in government who want to see you in court. And our fear about this was, because of prior restraint, that almost certain, our advice was that it was possible that a judge would grant this and say, argue it out afterwards. So our real fear here was that they would close down our reporting of this story.
So that's why you agreed
while we attempt to fight it in the courts. So we thought we'd have to find another way out of this. So we were involved with ProPublica, but we were also involved with the New York Times. We set up a collusion with the New York Times, and some of the material was sent to New York. And that we told the government this. We told the government we had allies, we had co-collaborators in this.
And copies of the material.
And copies. And they still insisted in saying, well, we will still go down the legal route unless we get the stuff back. So we met with some of the agents, and some of the agents said, well, we want the stuff, we will take it away ourselves. We said, well, no, you won't, we'll hang on to it. We'll destroy it ourselves. We said, well, no, we want to see it being done. In fact, we want to do it ourselves. So they then said, well, we want to see it because we want to do forensics on it. And so we realised that we had to destroy it ourselves because we were worried about Snowden himself, although he'd been outed. We didn't want anything that would evidentially add to the potential prosecution of Snowden. And they also wanted to see which of our reporters had worked on it and how. At one point they said, well, just give us the passwords, which was a slightly naive thing.
They asked you politely, as they can put it.
They did. They did ask politely, give us the reporter's passwords. So we said no. So we said, we'll destroy it. And they said, well, you need all sorts of equipment. And we said, well, tell us what sort of equipment. And they said, well, you need angle grinders. We said, well, we can cover that. Well, you need drills, so we can get that. You'll need masks. Well, we can cover that. You'll need eye shades, well, we can cover that. And you need a thing called a degaussor machine. At that point, on the black side of the rucksack, pulled this yellow machine out and put it on the table. It's about this big. And we said, what's that for? And they said, well, it destroys the magnetic field. And we said, we'll buy our own. And they said, it costs about £38,000. And we said, well, we won't. So we used those. So it was the most bizarre thing. So we decided to do this on a Saturday morning when not many people were around. And we did it in the basement, which is like any tall sort of office block in the middle of London. It's basically a concrete shell. But there's lots and lots of... We knew there was going to be a lot of dirt and dust and sparks and things like this involved in this. And it's slightly awkward because you don't want to be hitting any of the batteries or anything as you do it. And they showed us guidance through this. But we had to turn the sprinkler system off because what we were really worried about was the sprinkler system starting, the fire brigade would automatically come, that would probably be followed by the police, and we'd have a bit of a tricky explanation to the fire brigade explaining what we were doing in the basement, destroying. And we'd have had a tricky story, but presumably the spies from GCHQ would have had an even trickier story. So anyway, we went through this bizarre episode, which was entirely symbolic.
It was symbolic because you had the copies.
Yes, that's right.
You had the material.
Yes.
And explain to me, why is it that the British authorities reacted this way, whereas in the US at the same time, the American authorities sort of negotiated with the Washington Post, the New York Times, about what to publish and what not to publish. They talked about the authorities, about what could be considered a threat to national security, as they put it. Why do you think, how do you explain the differences between the American authorities' attitude and the British?
I think there's something ingrained. We noticed that in America, you have a radical right, you also have a radical left. And if you've got people, if you span from Glenn Beck to Michael Moore, if you span from Mitt Romney to Al Gore, you do that in America, and that was the expanse that was outraged about the Snowden revelations. There's also quite a strong streak in American thought and American history of small state and individual, the right of the individual to react against the state in that sense. We don't have that sort of history. We have a very curious history in Britain. We have a history of being very, very close to the United States. Remember, you know, we were the second largest in Iraq and Afghanistan. We supplied the second largest number of troops, etc. We are absolutely enmeshed with the United States. And there's also this sort of strange thing, this strange attitude is, well, spying is what we do to others. And that's a fact. And we've noticed that when people in sort of either authority or semi-authority come to talk about spying, whether it be on television or the radio, it takes an average of about 4 minutes into the conversation before they mention the words James Bond. And the underlying this seems to be quite proud. James Bond is a world away from the stuff we're seeing here, but underlying this is being quite proud that we can do this to other people. It is quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary.